Okay, next up, I want to talk about COVID trucks and convoys, the movements against vaccine mandates. And I want to give my thoughts on that. Now, when it comes to this, and this is, look, like I always say, I mean, if I want to upset everyone, I talk about COVID. So, prepare to be upset perhaps. When it comes to this entire COVID business, however, and the constellation of issues that are related to it, like vaccines, like health measures, like censorship, like mandates, all that stuff, I've said the same thing since August 2020. The same thing. One, beware of what is truly informed by healthcare, and some things are. And be wise about what is truly informed by politics, and things are. And I include in politics the exploitation of fear for political advantage and power. I and plenty of others have suspected that the strong force in all of this is politics. And it is, I think, clearer now than it was then. Lots of things were unknown then, lots of actions were taken then in light of huge guesswork. But right now I am seeing a lingering influence of the political, the power, and really stuff that doesn't make any sense in light of the healthcare. Now, I'm going to talk about one of the latest examples of this political advantage and power from the convoy in Canada. You might have heard of the Freedom Convoy, you might have heard of the Truckers Convoy, and all of the issues surrounding it. And that started when Canadian public health authorities announced vaccine mandates in late 2021, and that included truck drivers who crossed the border into Canada from the USA. Industry groups estimated that that was going to take about 16,000 truck drivers off the road, and those truck drivers evidently got quite upset by the mandates, and in response, by the 22nd of January 2022, the truckers had left in a convoy to Ottawa, the Canadian capital. They were there by Saturday the 29th when the protest kicked off, and police said, and I don't know honestly how reliable this is, but they said that they counted about 3,000 trucks and 15,000 protesters in Ottawa itself that first weekend. Many of them remained for up to 17 days. There were protests in other places as well. People turned out to cheer on the convoys in various places across the country as well, so it was a big movement. There was disruption caused by the movement, allegations of traffic obstruction, some business obstruction, nuisance like horns and things, logical outcome of having that many trucks and protesters camping up in a downtown area or near to it. But the biggest disruptions were the blockades, which are part of this. There was a blockade of the Ambassador's Bridge, over which a quarter of all trade between the USA and Canada passes. That's $323 million worth of goods every single day. The Freedom Convoy's GoFundMe page, before it was taken down, stated that their purpose was this: Our current government is implementing rules and mandates that are destroying the foundation of our business, industries and livelihoods. We're taking our fight to the doorsteps of our federal government and demanding that they cease all mandates against the people. The Freedom Convoy also did actively, repeatedly encourage people to be peaceful. I think that's important because you need to know where the movement itself at its core is coming from. There is no doubt that there were some moments in the fringe elements where there was some trouble, maybe a swastika here, a scuffle there. By the way, there's pretty much no large protest movement, left or right, even if they're peaceful, that doesn't have some ning-nong on the sideline who does the wrong thing. It's very common. Even here in Canberra we had ours, and I'll mention it in a minute, but in terms of protests we have here in Canberra, which is where I am right now, there is often something at the sideline that is not representative of the main movement. But overwhelmingly it does seem like it was in fact peaceful, certainly up until the police decided to clear them on. So, what do governments normally do when something like this happens? Or indeed something maybe even worse than this happens? Well, you might draw a comparison or a parallel with strike and industrial action. They can be hugely disruptive. Governments ordinarily negotiate. They get an outcome. They resolve it peacefully. Or what about something far worse? You could take the BLM riots, which burned and looted entire cities across America for days. Very little was done in reply to those at all. In fact, that's how you got the Kyle Rittenhouse case, because there was just barely any police presence. It wasn't being controlled, and people like him perhaps would reflect better on this now, but at the time, that's what he decided to go in there and help out. But here's some comparative examples. And so you ask the question, well, all right, so let's look at this truckers convoy. Let's look at this blockade of the bridge. What should happen here? Would it be negotiation? Would it be let it run its course? Would it be something else? Well, the response was pretty widespread and mixed. There was a couple of reasonable things done. I mean, there was trucking associations made statements distancing themselves from the movement. Okay. There was a legal action from residents who were tired of the truck horns honking for hours on end, and it was a nuisance case. Fine, nuisance is not lawful right across the Western world as far as I know, and so on. There was also a court action from affected businesses to remove the blockade because they were losing a lot of money. And again, okay, that's the sort of thing that you expect, especially when businesses are being impacted like that. But here's where it got crazy. It got crazy when the government, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, invoked the Emergencies Act. This is an act which was invented for things on the level of counter-terrorism measures. It grants the federal government and law enforcement extraordinary powers for 30 days if there is a, quote, urgent and critical situation that, quote, seriously endangers the lives, health or safety of Canadians. There's a list of possible reasons that it can invoke it, and one is public order, but it must be a public order issue that is considered a serious threat to the security of Canada. This was done amidst a lot of rhetoric from him, which he didn't back up with really any evidence to say that these truckers were a fringe minority that were, rhetoric around hateful and violent and swastika waving and unsafe and threatening. And then what happens? Well, GoFundMe decides to shut down their fundraising page, refunding $9 million to donors. Then the Toronto Dominion Bank froze 2 personal bank accounts, which received 1.4 million Canadian dollars in donations towards the convoy. And there was a court order then to ratify their decision to freeze those accounts. Police have frozen 206 other bank accounts, plus dozens of cryptocurrency wallets, a whole bunch of Bitcoin, I don't know what the word is, it Bitcoin addresses, URLs or something like that, but Bitcoins all looked into. Then the alternative platform used by the convoy, which was Give, Send, Go. By the way, don't use GoFundMe, everyone. Don't ever use GoFundMe. They do this all the time. So they use Give, Send, Go instead. Now that was hacked. And names and personal details of the donors to the convoy were leaked. And those donors, many of them now say they face death threats, they face loss of their jobs. There seems to be at least one confirmed case of that, closure of their businesses and other security issues. And a number of prominent people have been publicly outed in a cancel culture style effort to ruin their reputations. Meanwhile, the Attorney General of Ontario applied to have the $11 million of Give, Send, Go funds frozen because they were being used to support criminal offences. And the one that they identified was Mischief, and a court granted the order so the money can't be distributed. It's very interesting to me. They had to get a police officer to go into that court and sign an affidavit to say, well, this is the offence that's being enabled by this money. And they chose Mischief. I mean, you would think if there was really serious acts of violence and really serious criminality going on that really urgently needed to be stopped, they would come up with something better. They would have a police officer who could swear to something more than Mischief. It really does make you wonder. And finally, this all ended when there was an ugly police operation in Ottawa and I say ugly because I don't know whose fault it all was, but anyway, as these things do, it didn't go brilliantly. To clear out the protesters, arrests were made, there was resistance in some places, and you would have seen the images, for example, most people of the woman trampled by the police horse and things like that, all very unfortunate. And some sources say that this was the largest police operation in Canada's history. This is pretty crazy stuff. This is counter-terrorism powers, naming and shaming, cancel culture, Nazi rhetoric, armed police, stealing money. Why did any of this have to happen? Why? Was it to meaningfully improve the healthcare of Canadians? Was this because healthcare? With 90% of truck drivers already vaccinated and vaccines not doing a whole lot to prevent infection, or was it to make a political point? Was it an authoritarian reflex? Honestly, I don't even think you need to argue the point. Clearly, it's more on point 2 than it is on point 1. Here in Australia, we have a freedom convoy. We had a freedom convoy to Canberra, and it involved more people, I think, than the Canadian one, potentially, if I've got the numbers right there from the police, and they might not be. But certainly at least tens of thousands made the long trip to Canberra. And it may have been bigger, but I'm not going to engage in the guessing the crowd size game because it's just impossible. But whether Canada or Australia, all the other places that this has happened, it's quite true, it's totally true that the movements have involved real mixtures of people and a real cocktail of different views. But I just want to sort something out from all of this. And there's plenty of stuff, if you really want to engage in the whole distancing yourself from that person and this tattoo and that thing that was said and their background, I'm not going to do that. What I am going to say is, well, what was the actual nucleus of the whole thing? What was the shared concern by everybody involved? And what was the stated concern of these movements, which were real, amalgamations of things? Well, the shared thing was the concern about mandates. That is, first, the requirement that people be vaccinated to keep their jobs. That is, second, the requirement that people be vaccinated to cross borders or enter various establishments and businesses. Now, I want to be very clear. I am not opposed to vaccines per se. ACL is not opposed to vaccines, nothing like that. I'm not opposed to legitimate health measures that are proportionate at all. I know there's a real pandemic. I know some stuff had to be done, especially in the early days. But I have to agree on this. I have to agree that the mandates are surely a bridge too far. Omicron now poses an extraordinarily low risk to the individual. That's obvious. That shouldn't even be controversial to say. Hospitals are doing okay, despite having received barely a penny of funding extra during the lockdown to cope with this moment. The evidence is now mounting, and it really is, and for those who follow the papers on this and follow the academic stuff that's coming out, you know this, the evidence is mounting that whilst vaccines do reduce symptoms, they barely make an impact on transmission. Even The Lancet is now publishing that data. The Lancet isn't renowned for going against the zeitgeist or the flow on this. Not to mention, over 90% of Australians are vaccinated. It's world leading. I mean, how can you do better than that? You barely can, without, insane levels of coercion, like actually rolling people's sleeves up and chucking it in. Is it proportionate under these circumstances to pit someone's conscience against their duty to work and provide? Is it proportionate to create an unvaccinated underclass of people who don't have equal rights of movement or participation in society? Is it really proportionate? Does that really make sense? Is there no better way? Can we not test people? Can we not, even if we don't admit that being unvaccinated is not risky to others, even if we don't admit that, can we not test people? Are they not widely available? Can it not be done at far greater cost and far greater burden, especially at this stage that we've got this far? Even in wars, we've provided for conscience. Every history book warns against the kinds of divisions that we're seeing here. It is wrong. I say it's wrong because conscience must be respected. I say it is wrong. I say that conscience must be respected because I believe Romans chapter 2 verse 15, that God often convicts a person about right and wrong action through their conscience. Even when they don't fully understand why it might be right and wrong, it begins in the conscience, and it is God's voice. In many contexts, He can and does use it. Romans 2:15 makes that clear. I may not share that person's conviction, but I'm very slow to put pressure on it if they're not using it as some, artifice or excuse for sin. And I say it is wrong, these mandates and so on, because a person must work. Conscience matters, and they must work. Scripture says that the one who will not work, who refuses to work and provide for his family, is, quote, worse than an unbeliever. How can we pit these things against each other when the risk is so small? When we can't even be sure it's going to make a major difference? I say again, it is wrong. And I speak as someone who engages nearly daily with those who are affected. They are struggling, they haven't been able to get their conscience to a place where they can be vaccinated, and they have suffered for it. Now, I also do acknowledge that there are many who are vaccinated because they believe that they were doing the right thing. I completely acknowledge that. I really do. There are many people who took the vaccine because of a belief that this was right and this was good for our neighbours. Fine, I totally acknowledge that, but it's important that that doesn't make any one of us self-righteous. It's easy for the one who has the laptop job and who has got the vaccine to become self-righteous and say, well, they're less affected, or it's easy for the person without that niggle in the conscience not to respect the niggle in the conscience of the other person. And I do think in the spirit of Romans 14, you've got to do that. You can't impose this on other people. You've got to respect the conscience and let them stand before God. Let yourself stand before God for the decision you've made. It's easy to think ill of people, but it doesn't make this principle right. And surely we can agree that the principle is too much. The principle itself is wrong. We are breaking all the rules, by the way. Free and informed consent to medical treatment, just breaking the rules. Freedom of movement, it's supposed to be guaranteed, we're breaking the rules. Freedom of conscience, even in emergency, Article 18, International Covenant, Civil and Political Rights. State of emergency, doesn't matter, conscience still matters, we're breaking the rules. Equality before the law, rule of law, segregation, breaking the rules. We're breaking all the rules. And they've been written down time and again to warn us, to remind us not to break them, because they don't go good places. Again, it clearly isn't right. And I say this not because I'm an anti-vaxxer, I am not, but because I am pro-conscience, I am pro-work, I am in favour of equality before the law, and I'm very concerned about authoritarian responses. I say it because the threat posed by Omicron is very small to all of us, unless you are incredibly vulnerable, in which case you're incredibly vulnerable anyway, and you have taken precautions and you take precautions, okay? I say it because the burden of these mandates is very, very high when the threat posed by Omicron is very small. And because there are other ways to achieve the same or better health outcomes. There is no sense of proportion here at all. And we're breaking all the rules. Mr. Morrison, state premiers, if any of you watch this, I don't know, but it's way past time to tear down these mandates.